Hello, Book Stew viewers and listeners. On a cold January morning, I'm so happy to introduce you to Heidi Bell, who has a debut collection of short stories. Welcome, Heidi.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
The title attracted me as soon as I heard about the book, Signs of the Imminent Apocalypse and Other Stories. And don't we really feel that way now since we're very close to inauguration? Um, I really enjoyed your collection, and I have to say that I was surprised that some of the stories are as short as a page and a half or 2 pages, and some of them are like 20 pages, which is what you would typically expect from a collection. Over the course of how many years did you put the collection together?
Well, I think the oldest story in this collection I wrote when I was an undergraduate, which was many years ago. So probably 30 years, I would say.
Wow.
Yeah.
Do you see your writing? Because I mean, I think a lot of authors would take something that they wrote 30 years ago, stuff it in the drawer, and never let it see. I always think of my writers as having these kind of broken down IKEA dressers that they assembled incorrectly many years ago, and that's where the land of short stories that don't make it go. How did that work going back that far?
Well, I have plenty of those stories that I've left behind forever. So I have those too. But I think that anyone who's putting together a collection of short stories over the years knows that you keep putting in newer stories as you go, and you keep the best of what you've done, and until you get a collection that somebody actually wants to publish. And that was this book.
So you have won several awards for stories, and I saw from the front of the book that many of them have been published in literary magazines. That's what was it like when you were picked up in your by your first when your first story that got published got chosen? How did you? What was that like, and which one was it?
It was Fire. It's one of the shorter stories. And it was published in a lit journal called Crazy Horse. It's not called that anymore. I can't remember what it's called now. But it was a thrill. It was a real thrill because it was early on. I think I was in graduate school. And so it was a big deal to me. But the funny part is that then for years you don't get anything accepted. And so you really have to grow a thick skin as a writer who wants to be published because you just have no idea whether someone's going to accept your work or not.
Is there a commonality in what you think was accepted by some of these literary magazines?
Not at all.
That
Not
would
at
make it
all.
too easy, right?
Yeah, and so even now I send things out and I'll take a break for months when I get too discouraged, but you can easily send 50 to 100 things out before you get anything accepted. And then when you do get accepted, you're surprised. You're like, "Oh, someone likes this. I can hardly believe it." So
So,
it's
so
it's
is
a
it
pleasant
something like,
surprise.
do you forget what you've sent, and then surprise, surprise, 6 months later you get a nice email? Is that how it works?
Sometimes, yeah.
Did they ever? And I'm not really familiar with a lot of literary magazines. I did work as a book publicist for a while, and Plowshares, which is local to here, was one of our
Yeah.
clients. But I have no idea if they ever ask you to do revisions. And you are actually a professional editor, so I want to talk
I
about
am.
that as well. Did
Yeah.
you ever have anyone come back at you and say, well, we just don't like this paragraph, line, character, blah, blah, so could you give us this, this, and that instead?
I had one experience like that, but then they didn't take the revision, which was just heartbreaking.
No
Yeah.
fair.
Yeah, and which that's just I understand as an editor why that happens. And you get everything from yes, we'll take this story with no changes, to a few changes, to, we really like this, but we're not going to take it, which is, again, it's like, why did you tell me that? Just tell me no. I would rather you just said no than we really like it, but we're not going to take it.
Oh, or we loved your story, but it doesn't suit our needs right now, or
Right,
some like
right,
boilerplate thing like that.
right,
So,
right.
how did you become? Were you an editor before you were a writer? Did it happen simultaneously? How did you develop this kind of dual career?
So I went to graduate school to be a writer, and I kind of surrendered at a certain point. I thought I can't be a writer. It's not practical. I'll never make a living. Um, but I just decided to do it anyway because I really wanted to. And I did, and I've never regretted that decision to get an MFA. It was a great, great experience. And while I was getting my MFA and writing, I met a woman named Norma Van Reenen, who was the graduate advisor for the graduate student teachers. So we were all teaching assistants and we taught composition.
Hmm.
And Norma taught other classes as well. She taught theory classes in composition, and she taught a theory of grammar
Oh,
class, which I took and was one of the best classes I've ever had. It was fabulous. And I've always just loved language. I love everything about language and knowing all the details of language. And so I started out there really being able to delve into the theory of English. And she said, "You should be an editor." And I was like, you know what? I think I would really love that. I think I would really love that as a profession. And so after graduate school, my husband went to graduate school too. And so we moved around a little bit. But that kept occurring to me that I really wanted to edit. And so when we ended up here in Aurora, even though I was in my 30s, I found a press that would let me do an internship. And
ah.
that's how I really learned the sort of the business of editing for a publisher. And I was there for 9 months as an intern. They let me continue to do internships. It was very generous of them, and they taught me so much about editing and about using the Chicago Manual of Style, which now I use all the time as an editor.
How does editing someone else's work differ from self-editing your own?
Even editors need an editor. There is just something about creative writing. I really think that so much of it comes from an unconscious place that you cannot see your own writing the way that someone else can see it.
Hmm.
And so to have someone skilled in writing, in the not just the mechanics and the grammar part, but in the so I tell my clients, I'm the closest reader you'll ever have. I'm going to read this so carefully and just bring up questions and issues that maybe somebody who didn't read it as carefully would not notice.
So
So
you have
that's
an
critical.
editor for your own work as well.
I do. Well, I have friends who are very accomplished readers who are writers themselves. And so they serve that purpose. And then, of course, I always need an editor. People will discover things in my writing that I did not know were there.
Ooh, can you give us an example of that? Can you think of anything off the top of your head?
Well, I'll try to think of something. Well, okay, so when I was writing a story called Obscure Magic that's in this collection, I have a friend, Andy Mosina, who is a fantastic writer. He is so talented. He has several books published, and he's very logical. And he looked at this fairy tale and he said, he's just started asking a series of questions about the logic of the magic in this story and that I had not considered at all. And once I started thinking about it, he was so right that it didn't make sense. It didn't make sense even in the fantastical world that I'd created. And so I went back and did quite a lot of revising on that story.
That's amazing because I was going to bring up magical realism and fairy tales because there are some of the stories that clearly reflect Goldilocks and the Three Bears, Rumpelstiltskin, which I really enjoyed. So magical realism is a genre that isn't exactly my favorite, but I guess I have no idea how those two words got joined together because when you think of it, it's a contradiction in terms. But maybe that I don't even know how the genre was named. I know Alice Hoffman was, somebody that I read in the interest of keeping up with magical realism. How do you and not all your stories are fairy tales or reflect fairy tales or magical realism. Can you feel when a story is going to be take that path?
I think I start out with a certain story with the idea that it's going to be in some way related to a fairy tale. So the story that's a retelling of Rumpelstiltskin, for instance, which is called Peg's Cat, started as an exercise in a class I had as a graduate student called Form and Fiction, taught by the amazing Jamie Gordon, and she said, I want you to write just the beginning of a story that is somehow a retelling of a fairy tale. And so that's where that story came from originally. It took me a long time to finish it, but that's where it started. And so I think with the
Sorry, I
magic,
have to interrupt for a minute. I was so excited when I saw her blurb your book because I loved The Lords of Misrule. I thought that was
oh yeah,
such a fantastic book.
yeah, she's really a genius, and having her as a teacher and a mentor was just unparalleled. It's just amazing to have access to someone with that kind of skill.
So I'm going to ask you to do a brief reading. I picked out a part of a story. So there were two stories that were kind of domestic dramas, I guess, and those were the longest two, I think. And although I liked the fairy tale and magical realism component, I thought these two stories really were so realistic. They were almost like the characters were writing the story. I don't know how to explain it, but so can you do a little that short reading and then give us a little background, and then we'll talk about it afterwards.
Sure. Okay, I'm going to read from a story called Paradise is a Place with Plenty of Music. The protagonist is a 30 something man who works for a marketing firm. And his girlfriend, Georgia, his name is John, and his girlfriend, Georgia, moved in with him about a year ago, a little over a year ago. He is clearing his breakfast dishes from the table on the sun porch when his neighbor Steve appears in the driveway next door and gets into his Volkswagen. Steve can't park in his garage because Lynette, his wife, has claimed one side of it for her car and filled the other with boxes of summer clothes, old papers, and discarded exercise equipment. Steve has a permanent hangdog look, which John has noticed in many married men, as though he'd happily set out to marry a bossy woman without understanding the long-term consequences. John prides himself on having maintained most of the opinions he had before he met Georgia, including his suspicion that marriage brings out the worst in both parties. The subject has only come up between them as a joke. In the kitchen, he shoves the newspaper deep into the garbage can and washes his dishes at the sink, noting with mild shock that Georgia has washed her juice glass and wiped her toast crumbs from the counter, though probably only onto the floor. On his way to the bathroom, he can hear her humming something, and he pauses to listen in the hall outside their bedroom. What is that tune? Undetected, he watches Georgia comb her hair and smooth lotion on her arms and legs in front of the mirror, the slight bend of her body reminding him of Botticelli's Venus, newly born and riding the oyster shell to shore, her hair curling against the rose pink of her skin, the light of the lamp reflected in the mirror like white waves. He waits there, lulled by the sound of her voice. There are moments like this when George's presence in his house seems as ordinary as his own. Times when her shoes lined up in the entryway seem perfectly natural. Times when it doesn't startle him to close the bathroom door and find her pale silky robe hanging there like the skin of an animal. The name of the song occurs to him then. You Don't Know What Love Is. Chet Baker from the album they listened to last night. It's true that his guts twist a little each time he walks into the bedroom they've shared now for more than a year. A room rendered substantially smaller by George's mammoth dresser and the mound of clothing draped over the back of the armchair. It had happened without warning one May evening, after Georgia mentioned that the lease on her apartment would soon expire. The two of them were in John's bed, but it was still light outside, and the evening sun drew bright lines around the blinds. Georgia was hunting for her bra and underwear among the sheets, wearing only a pair of thin white ankle socks, and John was contemplating the perfect trough of her spine. Since meeting her, he had begun to see his earlier experiences with women as casual, his sexual interest and their half-hearted pretense at pleasure as silly, compared to the intensity of his desire now and the sound of George's voice climbing the scale like a hoarse clarinet. Her voice had captivated him the instant he'd heard it. Georgia finally found her bra between the pillows. So anyway, she said, arranging it on John's chest so that the beige cups covered his nipples, I'm looking at a place on Spate Street tomorrow after school. Should I just come over here afterward? Her fingernails were painted bright pink with white polka dots. Within that context, John's question seemed perfectly logical. Why don't you just move in here? He asked. Georgia leaned back on her heels and scanned his face with her brown almond-shaped eyes. John kept very still. It wasn't the first time she'd searched his face for something, nor the first time he'd wondered whether she would find it. What's the matter? He asked. I'm afraid, Georgia said. Aren't you afraid? John laughed. He was fairly certain he hadn't been truly afraid since he was a child, and Georgia made him feel giddy, brave, foolhardy. No, he answered, grinning. What are you afraid of? Well, now I'm afraid because you're not afraid. John reached out and traced the bumps of her larynx. Often when she spoke, he longed to be immersed in the reedy sound of it, or to enter it like a room and close the door. I want this, he said, and he kissed her. Georgia pulled away, frowning. You have to know it's not going to be like this all the time. We'll fight, you'll grow to resent me, and then we'll have to get married. They laughed for a long time, and John felt buoyant and happy. Then Georgia wiped the tears from beneath her eyes and said, Okay, then.
I liked that section because it got into a man's head in the early stages of a relationship. And I think because I read a lot of, I guess, women's fiction, feminist fiction, that I don't encounter that very often. And I thought you did a fine job of really, it's almost like you were there in his head. I think the whole book, the stories, have really fine interludes of men's heads and women's heads. Is that something that interests you as a general subject, like the differences between or the similarities between?
Yes. First of all, I think I got to a point in my writing where I was tired of writing about myself and my own experiences, and I really wanted to try to imagine experiences from other points of view that weren't so much like mine. And I also think that I really want to understand why people act the way they do. And I think that writing helps me do that. It helps me imagine, why would a person act this way? And so that's where that story came from. I really wanted to understand why someone would act the way a person like John acts.
Yeah, was that the story that took place during Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill, or was that a different story?
Yes, no, that was that story.
So that was pretty, their responses and reactions to the whole situation. I think I can remember going through it and my husband just not like I was perturbed because he wasn't getting upset, and
Yeah.
that was really a clear differentiation because he could not relate to the situation in the way that I could, of course. So I thought that was a great underlying subject for a story, but you went beyond that to really explain or show what was the meat of their relationship. Do you feel like since you are a Midwesterner, and a lot of literary stuff appears to have been generated from people on both coasts or writing about both coasts, how do you feel about being a Midwestern writer? Do you consider yourself a Midwestern writer?
I definitely consider myself a Midwestern writer, but at the same time, I think I don't really know what that is because I am one. It's very hard to know. I think I'm impatient with some of the things that maybe you're talking about when I see so many books about a professor who works at an East Coast college or a protagonist like that. I'm not that interested in those stories personally. I think they've been told so much. And so maybe being a Midwestern writer, I have a different set of subjects that I'm interested in looking at. And also, I think maybe in the details of my stories, there are details of just being in the Midwest and um, watching people do yard work or being, driving to work in the fall. Even little details of the setting that are Midwestern, I think define my work. And so it's hard for me to say I'm Midwestern in these ways because I think human nature is the same regardless of where you live.
Yes, with definitely different sets of challenges and experiences. Um,
Yes.
how did you? So your book was published by a university press, and I have from other writers who I've spoken to, they have generally felt like this was a great launching place. I'm thinking specifically of Disha Philyaw, who I had on the show, and I'm eagerly
Oh,
awaiting, any movie that gets made of
yeah.
her collection. But I think she was very positive about being picked up by a university press. How do you feel about that?
Great. First of all, I love her book. It's so wonderful. So I too am waiting for her next thing. Um, yes, it was a very positive experience. Like I said before, it's kind of a surprise when someone finally wants to publish your thing that you've been working on for so long. So it was delightful in that way. And this particular press is run out of the University of Wisconsin Stevens Point, and it's a teaching press. And so um, Dr. Ross Tangadal is the man who runs the program, and his students worked on the book with me. So I had a great editor, Ellie Atkinson, who um, kind of shepherded my book through the publishing process there. So it was different from the work that I do as an editor with publishers because I was working with students.
What's a teaching press? Is it like a teaching hospital, which we have millions of here?
Yeah, it's so. Dr. Tangadal is teaching publishing, editing, and publishing classes, publicity. So the kids there are getting certificates in publishing in one way or another, so that when they get their undergrad, they'll have the certificate that will help them if they want to be in publishing. They want to
Oh,
work in
that
publishing.
sounds like a fascinating program. We're running out of time, but I just have one question more for my own curiosity, as because I do line editing sometimes for friends who are writing. And what's the study of composition like?
So the study of composition talks about it helps you teach composition by teaching you about things like discourse communities. So, certain discourse community has its own lingo what we would call jargon now. Um, they have their own vocabulary, and sometimes one of the great things I learned in composition theory is that sometimes people use the vocabulary of their discourse community to keep people out of their community.
Oh.
And that made a lot of sense to me when I really love reading theory. I was a women's studies major, and so I read a ton of theory, feminist theory. And I would notice that sometimes the writing was so convoluted. And I learned through learning about style and sentence structure that really it wasn't necessary for them to write that way, but that maybe there was another goal, which was that you had to really work to get what they were saying. And you had really had to put the effort in to get what they were talking about as a way of sort of being a gatekeeper in a discourse community. So that's one thing that I learned in composition theory. And then you learn how to teach it. You learn about rhetoric and like a rhetorical situation and how to teach students to write an argument to, a certain audience, or to write a comic to a certain audience. That you teach students to be aware that you're always writing to a certain audience and in a certain context.
It all sounds very fascinating to me. Now I always wish that I had gone to journalism school, but now maybe I think I should have tried to do an MFA instead. But what's next up for you? Are you still continuing to write short stories? Is there a novel stuffed in that old IKEA dresser?
Well, I have been working on the novel. It's slow going, and so sometimes I'm sure I'll write some short stories in between there. But yeah, I am slogging forward on writing a novel.
Well, I would love to have you back on Book Stew with your next publication because I think the stories I enjoyed, and you've just kind of imparted to the Book Stew viewers and listeners kind of some just practical, interesting advice. And ideas. So I really enjoyed having you on the show. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll watch for your novel.
Thank you so much. It was a
Thanks,
pleasure to
Heidi.
talk to you.
Bye bye.
Bye.
So, Book Stew viewers and listeners, wasn't that fascinating? Now, don't you all want to go and get your MFAs? Or at least read Heidi's great book, which Signs of the Imminent Apocalypse. Thanks again, Heidi, and good night, everybody.